Hello, welcome to Agile Encounters. My name is Paweł Feliński. Together with me, Tony Richards. The topic we will discuss today is what's possible with Kanban. The truth is that this discussion, that encounter, comes from the fact that both Tony and I thought that there's a lot of people telling you what's the theory of Kanban using very proper language related to Kanban, but it's so disattached from reality. And we want to show you, based on our experience, what's possible with Kanban without going into Kanban buzzword, so focusing on the outcomes rather than details of how to implement it, how to go through it step by step. We will start with a slightly controversial topic. So what is Kanban? Because apparently, depending on who says or who asks, Kanban may mean slightly different things, and there are a few misunderstandings based on that. So we're going to start with explanation which Kanban we're talking about. Then a few histories about what drives Kanban, what are the principles behind it, and what makes Kanban teams successful. What's the secret sauce? And finally, what everybody's waiting for. So what is obvious with the Kanban method, but also what is possible, not necessarily so obvious. At the very end, we'll have a tiny surprise for you, so stay with us as long as you can. Right, let's carry on. I remember, Tony, because I'm pretty sure you have very similar experience. I remember it was 6 years ago, somewhere here in Poland, at one of the conferences, a lady, head of IT in a bigger retail company, approached me, and we knew each other. I used to work for them for a few times. She asked me for guidance, and I told her based on what are discovered that the Kanban method would be really a perfect fit for them, because what they were providing in that particular part of the organization was a service rather than a product. And she said, "No, Kanban, no, definitely no. We tried it already." And I look at that. I look at her. I knew how not advanced their Scrum teams are at this stage, because they're very early at their transformation. And I thought, no way. It can't be that you already tried Kanban and you tell me that Kanban is not works for you. So I need to ask a few more questions. And I discovered that by Kanban, she meant, well, we have a task board with columns. While when I said Kanban, I meant something completely different. Do you have similar stories like that?
Yeah, I've had teams or areas I've been introduced to in the past, and they've had, as you say, very, very large boards on the wall, physically in person, and that's been their reference of Kanban. But they're still really frustrated because nothing was improving, nothing was changing, but they put all the work up on the wall, and that was where they were. That was their understanding of the end. That was the end of the journey, and they were done.
And I think that the biggest surprise is that if somebody thinks that's Kanban, they are technically right. It depends on which Kanban you're talking about. So Tony and I, we thought that we're going to tell you a few words about different Kanban definitions. I literally had very similar conversation a month ago with other customer of mine, and they were surprised because I gave them 4 different definitions, asked which is right. They selected not the same one, by the way, because the work was in a couple of teams, and we concluded that no, all definitions are appropriate. So let's start from the basics. Kanban, literally from Japanese, one of translations, is a pull signal. So in other words, typically a visual indicator that somebody is ready to take more, to pull more work. If you are in an office or in a shop and there's a shopping assistant behind the counter, and she says, "Next, please," this movement, this is literally Kanban. I'm giving a visual signal. I'm ready to pull more because what I was doing was done. Doesn't make sense, Tony.
It does, and it's funny you mentioned shops, because the original person who's cited as coming up with a lot of what we're talking about today, Taiichi Ono, he observed supermarkets, and he noticed that when the stock on the shelves started to sort of deplete, so if you imagine the milk starts to diminish and disappear off the edge of the shelves, that was a signal to bring more stock out and fill the shelves up. And that inspired him to come up with this idea of bringing out more inventory, more stock, when you see that pull signal, as you say, in real life in that case.
Another definition, absolutely correct as well as this one, is Kanban understood as the Kanban board. So it's a simple technique. In some books, you would find it out written with small k letter, not capital one. The Kanban has a board that visualizes the workflow. Different columns are different steps of the workflow, and work items within it, different cards. I think this is the most popular understanding of it. The very unfamous, in my opinion, method that was quite popular over a decade ago, Scrumban, was literally Scrum, the Scrum framework, and the Kanban board, not any sophisticated method. How often do you find people thinking that Kanban is just the board, Tony? I wonder what's your experience in your market.
I think it has become a little bit of an association that's quite commonplace, because it's easier to make that association for something that's maybe a little intangible. It's hard to sort of put your finger on what it is. So people will often go for something that's visible first, which I suppose is one of the elements of the Kanban method. But yeah, I can see how people make that relationship very early in their careers, and they start to use that quite a lot.
My point of view is also that maybe some bad work was done by popular tools that must not be named, online digital tools, where you can create Kanban board no matter what method, what framework you have applied. And then technically they're right, any board that visualizes workflow and work items within it, it's a Kanban board, but that's not the point, I believe. All right, so now an interesting concept that is already slightly more advanced, the Kanban system. What is it? This is my definition. It's not necessarily the one that you would read in the book, but a Kanban system is not a board only. It's something absolutely more. It's the entire system that consists of a board, absolutely, but different policies applied to it, metrics and charts, cadences and roles. However, the majority of them are optional. You don't have to have roles or meetings, cadences or metrics, or not all of them. But the system that you create, where the board is the central part and everything is around, that's also Kanban. I tend to name it Kanban system, not just Kanban, but very often I hear people, when they use the phrase Kanban, they refer to a Kanban system, which is not yet a full method helping you manage your work and the workflow, but not a board anymore. I'm not sure, Tony, if you want to add something on top of that.
I don't think there's anything I can add to it, really, because as you say, it's a collection of things, isn't it? So you can think of it systemically as, on its own, they all add some kind of value, but when you bring them together, as you have there on that one visual, their combined inputs are much more powerful when it comes to visualizing and managing work.
I think so. Now, the final definition that I have on another slide is fourth one over here, but I've just realized, and not four only, I think there are more, is what we call the Kanban method. So it's a method for knowledge work management, having principles, practices, and using boards or actually Kanban systems. That's the method developed, among others, by David Anderson, and it's used by the Kanban University and related schools of thought. So that's way more than just a system. Just a board is actually a full method that helps organization grow, an alternative way for achieving the state of agility, business agility. But do we have any other Kanbans, Tony? I'm thinking, for instance, about pro-Kanban organization, which is so far away from Kanban University and their Kanban method, but what they teach is also Kanban, which is more than a system. How to define it?
Well, in terms of other organizations that introduce Kanban, well, I suppose you've got initiatives, as you say, from the world of Pro Kanban. You also got initiatives from Scrum.org as well. Have done some work around this, around how you can use the ideas in the Kanban method to support Scrum implementations and add to it or augment it. But yeah, they all take a slightly different path in, I've noticed. They're not the same. Whilst we're talking about the same thing, which also adds to some of the confusion that you're seeing out there today, I think.
I think what Kanban University preaches, what they sell ultimately, it's a spin-off of the original Kanban practice that originates in manufacturing and related approaches. However, the method is way more, if I say it. The bottom line is, whichever Kanban you use, definitely need to understand. You need to achieve a mutual understanding with a person or a team you're working with. Which Kanban are we talking about? I discovered recently that I was hired, among others, to implement the Kanban method. That's what I was told, but what the team thought is that we are implementing Kanban board in Jira only, and they couldn't understand initially why they need the support of an Agile coach full-time here. When we have that clarified, that was absolutely eye-opening event for them. What is essential is that from now until the end of the webinar, Tony and I will be talking mainly about the Kanban method as described by Kanban University. It's not that what is obvious or possible with Kanban is impossible if you use Kanban from any other school, not Kanban University, but both Tony and I are accredited Kanban trainers, and simply that understanding of Kanban is closest to what we do. All right, so Tony, let's talk a bit about principles, different principles. Before that, if you want to hear more of us talking about Kanban, I just realized we already had a conversation a year ago. Tony and I discussed different practical application of the Kanban method. Visit our YouTube channel. All our webinars, including this one, are there. That's available for you for free, and you can also look at that content. Not necessarily if you're interested in Kanban. We have other webinars on OKR, how to become an Agile coach, enterprise Agile coach. That database of our know-how is available for you. Now, the principles. When we talk about principles in the Kanban method, I find, or my students find, this concept very theoretical. Am I right?
Yeah, I think the way it's presented, it gives itself an air of theory around it, but they are very practical when they're used.
Intentionally, Tony and I, we are not in position here to present all the principles, 6 principles that the Kanban method defines, but there are 2 categories, 2 sets of them, one related to service delivery, another to change management. Let's start with service delivery, Tony. So what's so practical about principles behind the Kanban method that touch the service delivery topic?
So I've spoken to you about this before, actually. I always see these 2 groups of principles in a very simple way in my mind. One is looking from the outside in, and one's looking from the inside out. And what I mean by that is when we talk about the service-orientated principles, that's looking at it from the perspective of the person who's requesting something from you. So whether that's someone outside your organization, another team you provide a service to, the service-orientated principles are governing and sort of guiding how you provide that service to them and improve it over time. And on the flip side, the change management principles are looking very much inside out. So I feel they are helping the team or the area behind the service in question improve over time. And the example I have on this, the practical example, is an HR team I was working with. We started to introduce this way of working across our whole HR practice. And one of the observations they made, which I'd never before, was they wanted a change management plan put together, a traditional change management plan of how they were going to introduce this way of working across all of their HR specialists. And as we worked through it, they had this recognition or this dawning moment that the change management principles and the way we were approaching introducing the Kanban method was by itself an approach to change management. So those principles are very practical when organizations are trying to navigate change, whatever that change may be. They still stand really well in that situation, which is why I say they can come across as academic when you first see them, but when you start to use them and apply them, they're very, very real world. They're very applicable, and that was my experience. How about you, Paweł?
I'm with you over here. If I were to compare the big two methods, so Scrum, the Scrum framework, and the Kanban method, I would say they're pretty similar in terms of the principles. So what we call the service delivery principles, the three principles in the Kanban method that talk about understanding your customer and their needs. This is what you will hear also at training for product owners, for instance. I do agree with you that something that to me is unique for the Kanban method are the change management principles. So the method itself has principles and then practices embedded inside that help roll out the method in an organization. With Scrum, I see Scrum Master are pretty often lost. The only guideline that they receive is, well, that's the framework, just do it, follow the rules. And it's not so easy, not always it's so easy. So I'm with that service, the change management principles is something unique and really powerful. What else? Another thought of mine, when we were describing how different the setup of these two sets of principles is it reminded me a longer definition of the Kanban method. I can't quote the entire one, but it's a method that, among others, help team or help in general, help us meet customer demand with team capability. We need to understand the customer, the service we provide their needs, and the demand also. So it's way more than just understanding what's valuable to them. But we also need to focus on what we can change internally. We will not change the market easily. We'll not change the customer, but we can change our own process internally. That's behind the change management principles in order to have capability and capacity that meets the demand. That's how I see it. Anything else about the principles?
No, nothing sort of jumps out straight away. But I do like the way you described that you're focusing on your capability inside and then your ability to meet the demand outside. So yeah, the way you describe it, it still reinforces that inside out, outside in way of looking at these things. So yeah, they're just useful ways of reminding yourself as you work through this how to keep improving and how to carry on journeying as a team or as a service area into more and more improvements as you go along. And as you say, no, there's no kind of perfect silver bullet out there. This is why I think this is a good example of you start somewhere and then you iterate or you move continuously towards a new place, and these principles keep you on that path.
Absolutely. I think also that the way how Kanban method talks about it, we often say service lens. So it is perfect fit for any service that you deliver. But I think it's also applicable for product delivery. I have no doubt. Any other way, the Scrum method, the typical lens are we deliver product. I have product backlog, product owner. There's no problem to use Scrum for the service. In the Scrum framework, somehow these two worlds, internal improvement and external customer, are separated. There's one Scrum team, of course. Events that everybody looks at, but I have a product owner focusing on that, and I have Scrum Master focused internally on improving everything. It's not true that they work independently. It's all together. In the Kanban method, the principles are equally applicable to everybody, and you know it from day one of any kind of training. All right, I think we're ready to move on. If any of you is interested in rolling out the Kanban method in your context, but you are aware of attending a training session or hiring a company for a longer transformation, you just want to catch up and talk for 1 hour about what's possible and how it looks like, don't hesitate to visit the website. The QR code is visible on screen below the video. Will have also a link. You can set up a meeting either with Tony or myself for a short mentoring and coaching or consulting, and we can tell you more. We can answer the questions that might be really specific to your company. Now, moving on, let's take a look at what's possible with the Kanban method. And I think you would agree, Tony, that the very first thing that teams or organizations tell us about rolling out the Kanban method when they try is that visibility has increased. Am I right?
Completely, yes. Even if they had a spreadsheet or something with all their work in before, the way in which you visualize that work changes. And I think the thing that strikes me most when I work with areas or organizations is that they're no longer seeing the work as static or just a list like a photograph. It's more like a video. It's more work in motion, more work in its kind of dynamic sense, is they start to see it that way. And the visibility is probably underplayed, really. It really does change the way people inspect and ask questions about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
How about you?
I very often ask my students at various training sessions, do they see a difference between visibility and transparency? It might be a language barrier topic, hard to say, but I remember a question that was devastating for many students trying to pass one of professional Scrum assessments with Scrum.org. How can you tell the product backlog is transparent, or what does it mean that the product backlog is transparent? A basic question, in my opinion, but the majority of answers were, well, it's transparent because you have access to it. So it's not hidden. For me, it's not yet transparency, it's the visibility. And the transparency is way more. It's because of the visibility, you also have understanding of why behind, of purpose. With the product backlog, for instance, you understand why it is ordered in that way, what higher purpose or vision it serves, and so on. But coming back to the Kanban method, for me, no-brainer. If you have a board, your work is visible. Already it's a gift, but not each team is aware of the fact initially that it also increased overall transparency. We have less status meetings because everything is clear on the board. If it's not clear, we improve the board. I'm not talking about the columns or swim lanes or cards, but the card design, what information is on the card, or different policies around, or the entire, we call it already, the Kanban system around, including meetings, perhaps roles, the roles as well. I was surprised a month or 2 months ago when I learned from one of my customers that the most common way of visualizing work is writing down notes in your personal notepad. And it's the 21st century, guys. Then no board. So for these kind of teams, having any kind of board is already a huge step forward. But many teams do use board. They have a lot of boards, especially in IT. Having a proper Kanban system, not only a board to do ongoing done, in my opinion, increases not only visibility but full transparency as well. Fair enough. What's next? What's also obvious when you think about the Kanban method, of course, are limits of the work in progress. In your experience, how easy or difficult it is to implement work in progress limits, Tony?
Well, that's obviously a trick question. This is devilishly hard to put in place because the whole way a lot of organizations are set up today, there's almost a badge of pride associated with being really busy, and people are encouraged to actively be busy. So the whole idea of limiting how much work you do sounds almost an affront, or it's challenging that whole idea of busyness. Now, the reality is it's not. It's just saying, I'd like you to be busy focusing on less things, ideally one thing if you can, but really sharpen your focus. So in my simple view, I often try and stress this is about creating focus and concentration around something, not just limiting the amount of work you do, because people will sometimes think, oh, well, if I'm not doing all the work, then what's my boss going to think, or what's my organization going to come think at the end of the year? So it's really important that you stress the benefits, the why you're limiting the work, I think. But going back to your original question, it's really hard to get this in place, not easy, and the team can be very vulnerable doing this, because they can sometimes be the only ones doing this in their organization to start with. I mean, what's your experience been, Paweł?
My experience is teams are so creative in finding out excuses not to implement work in progress limits. And I'm always amazed because I can't say 100%, 95% of cases I work are teams that has just been trained properly in the Kanban method. And as a part of the training, we always have a simulation. And in the simulation, they always experience workflow without work in progress limits and with work in progress limits. And they, not me, they draw conclusions, how important it is. They did experience it. And yet, next day, they arrive to the office and either they say we don't want to experiment with work in progress limits, or a team of 7 people also saw it. They invent a work in progress limit of 40, for instance. A team of 7 people in one column limit 40, they would never reach the limit. Actually, they did. That team did. But one thing is to set work in progress limit. Another is to really pay attention to it, to really use it, because the fact that you set it but you don't respect it doesn't mean that that it actually works. In my cases, it takes whatever between 2 weeks to even 3 months to convince the team, to help them, maybe not convince, to help them start using work in progress limits. And when they start, what typically happens, Tony, at least in the cases you've seen?
So what I've seen, it's interesting. There's a few different dynamics happen. So often reveals the well-meaning individual in the team who says yes to everything. So they tend to individually pull lots and lots of items, and they're quickly getting up to the whip limit on their own. And there's a sudden recognition in the group of, oh, hang on, they're saying yes to everything. They're pulling everything in. There's hardly any whip left. So I found it's useful for opening that conversation in a respectful way. So not saying that what they were doing was necessarily wrong or bad, but just indicating if you've got 14 items and there's 14 of you, aren't you going to get through those 14 items quicker if the 14 of you get involved rather than that one individual takes 14 on? And even with the most heroic individual, they've got to switch between them. So it's going to take them longer than if 14 people do those individually. So it opens up a dialogue about how you most effectively get the work done when you're thinking as a real team and not just a group of individuals who happen to work for the same person and have the same area of the organization. So that, for me, that's the big kind of revelation that I think it draws when it starts. But I'm suspecting you've seen some other byproducts of whip limits coming in. So what have you seen?
So I've seen a lot of conversations that I think for the same reasons, team tries to hack it. For instance, a question: do we need to visualize everything on the board? Can we visualize only these tasks that are at least 1 hour long? My question is, how do you know a task will take more than 1 hour? Very often you know when you start. You thought it's 15 minutes, 1 hour. It's one question. Another, I can imagine a person would have nothing on the board, but still will be very, very busy, because 8 hours at work you will spend on hundreds of tasks that take 10 or 15 minutes. So should it be below the radar or above the radar? That's interesting conversation with the team. Another conversation is, do we visualize everything? Maybe somebody has Kanban board and a separate no Kanban board, separate project where they have other tasks. But when that kind of thinking is switched, eventually something clicks, and I think from that moment, rolling out or the other general practice of the Kanban method and other related are way faster, way better. I personally haven't experienced that situation so much that teams want to have higher limit because they want to prove they are busy. It happens, but not so often, in my cases at least. More often, it's the fact they are afraid of doing nothing because they are blocked. Because
Yes.
the team I was referring to, 7 people and the work in progress limit 40, and they hit the limit, was not because they were working in parallel on 40 items. It was because 35 items were blocked by external parties. They were waiting for external teams, stakeholders' answers, and that's why they started doing something new. To change that kind of thinking was very tricky, but eventually it led us to interesting conversation on focusing on the blockers. I remember their line manager stepping in because he saw the board. He knew where the bottleneck is. He saw a lot of pink cards, pink color meant blocked, and we had something that in lean management in TPS, Toyota Production System, was called stop the line. He reached out to his manager and the stakeholders and informed them that for next weeks my team will not deliver anything because they will focus fully on unblocking things. And actually they didn't develop a lot because many blockers were external blockers. It was kind of negotiation of different agreements with different parties. For instance, they discovered that half of the work, 45% of the work they received, shouldn't be received by that team. There's a separate maintenance team who should do that. But customers very often approach the development team because they found development team faster than maintenance team. That's why my team, sorry to say so, my team was flooded by the work. So I think that limiting work in progress when you finally implement it fully has an unexpected consequence that everything is blocked on your board. And then we have a gentle and appropriate conversation about how to unblock it. I think it's even smarter if you roll out the Kanban method with multiple teams in parallel because they block each other. You can work with many teams. I know, Tony, you had such an experience in the past, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, just before we get onto that, you reminded me of something else actually. That one way I introduce whip limits when I'm talking to an area is to explain that they already have whip limits, so they already exist. They're just not visible. And they may feel really busy now. So how would you feel if I add a couple of more things on your plate? So I ask you to do 2 more. Oh, no, I couldn't do any more. Okay, so how many are you doing at the moment? They'll say how many they're doing. So does that fit? Oh, no, I feel too busy. So what would feel comfortable that you could do repeatedly? And they'll come up with a number. I say, well, that sounds a little bit like a manageable whip limit for you in its entirety. And we do that with everyone in the team. And then we're getting a group, like a team level whip limit. And then we work out, well, where would that allocate across your Kanban system? But I do start with this idea that you've already got whip limits because you can't say yes indefinitely forever. Because even if you do, you're not going to work on it. So you know instinctively yourself where your limit is. And
very
often
nice approach, very nice coaching approach. I really like it.
Well, it's trying to get people to think, well, you're not introducing something new. All you're doing is you're taming something that's really driving you at the moment. You want to flip it the other way around, so you have a level of control over it yourself. But yeah, in terms of your other question, and you might have to remind me again now, you were talking about multiple teams and bringing it in to show the blocking of each other. When you do this with multiple teams, obviously it comes with its own challenges because introducing this to multiple areas at once is quite challenging. But as you say, you can start to see that one person's dependency is often another person's blocker. And when you start to make that kind of link and you've changed the language of dependency to blocker, then suddenly people look at dependencies in a totally new way as well, rather than I'm just going to wait and it's a handoff, or I'm going to try and plan this dependency to the finite degree so it always works as it should. You're now saying, well, a dependency is actually a form of a blocker on someone else. So how do we minimize the number of blockers? That might remove some of the dependencies that we have an ability to influence. We're not going to remove all dependencies because they exist. But as you say, when you do this with multiple teams, you make that visible. So it's not just your board, you're now making links between the teams visible through the form of blockers.
I remember one of the dependency maps that you created with one of your customers, it was so clearly visible when you look at the spaghetti, the mess, that the majority of dependencies were interdependencies among the teams. So something technically within their control. Because if it's a dependency on a third-party supplier, on the customer, it's harder to influence. But if you have your mess within your own system, now understood not as a system of Kanban system of one team, but a system of multiple Kanban systems of multiple teams, you still can manage it. We have practices helping solve the spaghetti easily, and that's what's possible with Kanban. All right, let's move on.
Okay.
Because I think from what is obvious, we are already gently going to what is possible with Kanban. Many people, whenever we think of Kanban, they talk about predictability, and I think that's the big thing. Something that definitely is not touched by other agile methods in such a comprehensive way. In Scrum, we talk about forecasting. I think in Kanban, you could use the same phrase, but we have something that other methods don't have. What's that?
That question to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, the Kanban method measures a lot of things. You don't have to measure them all at once, and you don't have to do them all to start with, but it does measure things. It measures things like how long does it take from when you receive a request to when you deliver it. So when you finished it, and how often do you deliver those finished requests? And as we've already talked about, it measures the level of work in progress. So we've got our limits. So that's the level at which we know we can operate well. But you also have your WIP level, so the level of work in progress at the moment, which is different. They're not always the same. Ideally, you want to pull to the WIP limit, but you might not always be in that situation. And the other thing, another measure I think of that's very, very useful, I know it gets used in quite a lot of areas now, not just in the Kanban world, but also you mentioned Scrum. I've seen Scrum teams using this now, is work item aging. So how long has the work been on the board? It's not the same as being blocked, but just generally, how long has it been aging in a particular area or a column of the board for a period of time? So there's some great metrics, and there's even more in the Kanban method, and it's often about trying to find out which ones are going to give you the most insight to start with. And I know when we both teach these classes, Paweł, we often suggest you start with certain ones. So where do you normally start with metrics when you're teaching a class?
I was, when I entered the Kanban world years ago, I was quite surprised that all Kanban geeks said a lot of warm words about cumulative flow diagram that you can see here on top, by the way. It's not that this diagram is irrelevant, it's wrong, it's bad. I think it's unique for the Kanban method. We don't have direct equivalent of that in other methods. But I think what is way more important, and not only to achieve predictability of your Kanban system, but and delivery ultimately, but also to manage the workflow, is the lead time / cycle time. Depending on school, we have two different definitions. Let's stick to lead time as Kanban University suggests. Lead time histogram, for instance, I think it's the most powerful tool that I typically start with at the beginning. First of all, because initially it gives you data about the state of your Kanban system, how predictable you are or not. If you follow it over weeks, you see how it changes, and it's very practical. It gives us something that already, for instance, the Scrum framework doesn't, at least not out of the box, a sense of predictability way better than in case of using the product burndown chart, for instance. All other charts and metrics like flow efficiency, hard to measure in my opinion, because it's hard to measure the touch time in many cases. Cumulative flow diagram, heat maps, work item agings, or Monte Carlo analysis, this is all good, but for me to be discovered slightly later. I try to expose my teams to lead time histogram or equivalent throughput histogram that you can see here on the picture as well, as early as possible. Bad news, in my opinion, for many Kanban teams is that metrics, charts, Kanban, it's all about statistics. And you can love it or you can hate it. It's like with New York City. I heard once. I know few Kanban coaches that are really, really focused. I would even say fixed on charts. They are really data men kind of people. It's not my cup of tea, really. I don't want to kill my customer with statistics. I'm not an expert in statistics either. For me, it's one of many practices that Kanban brings out of the box that are useful. But at some point in time, you need to understand it. Recently, I delivered a private class for one of our customers here in Poland. They literally asked me for something that I think should be obvious after a few training sessions. Okay, we have these charts. Now, what to do with them? I'm looking at cumulative flow diagram. I'm looking at a product burndown chart, for instance. I can interpret it. I know what axis means, what each bar means. But now what? What is the action? So we focused full 2 days looking at it, how to read it and how to plan the actions. And I realized that standard training sessions, they do not talk about it. They explain you what a chart is about, and they just touch the topic, what you can do with the knowledge. But there's not yet enough information for you to make decisions. At the end of the day, my opinion is that whatever metrics or charts you use, they should inform your decisions. If you don't have the information based on the chart, perhaps something is missing.
I'd agree with that, because I know when we run the sessions with examples of many of these kind of visuals, we start to go through exercises where the group then start to try and become detectives and work out what might be happening under the surface. And then they get a feel for what does a chart look like when it's behaving as it should, or when the Kanban system is behaving in the way in which you'd like it to behave. And what does it look like where it's starting to go off the handle, it's starting to go out of control, and the predictability is going, which was your point around this. The analogy I use a lot, and I don't know about yourself, is I use the sat navs in cars and the kind of information that gives you, because a sat nav is doing all this in the background anyway. When it's trying to estimate when your fuel's going to run out or when you're going to arrive at your destination, it's doing these kind of statistical calculations continuously. And with the destination example, the closer you get to the destination, the more accurate, the more predictable that arrival time is getting, because there's less possibility, there's less time for it to go off. Whereas at the very start of your journey, it's just an estimate. It's like it's taking a very small sample of data and it's having to extrapolate a huge kind of jump in belief around what will happen. You don't know if there'll be roadworks or there'll be terrible weather or whatever. So I try and say, well, you are surrounded by these kind of things already, whether if you're a driver or something else, some other appliance you use. But often with these charts, it's just understanding how to read them and see them in a way that they give you off those early warning signals. Am I going to get where I need to on time? Or is the team going to run out of fuel before we get to the end? That I think that's the important part, as you say, making it practical and actually ideally putting it in their world, in their work.
I'm surprised we came up with the same example for our training sessions, but I'm using not SatNav, but Google Maps or navigation using Google Maps during Scrum training sessions when I explained the difference between velocity and average velocity and what is used for. But I'm with you. Coming back to the topic. I think what is essential with metrics and charts within the Kanban method is not to flood your team with all of them at once. Start with one, but understand it, and then, if needed, add more and more and more. I know people or teams or coaches that want to focus on everything. It's a mess. It's a mess, and actually, it decreases the transparency, not increases as it should. Fair enough. Another topic that is even less obvious, in my opinion, whenever you roll out the Kanban method, is the topic of scaling. There are training sessions about scaling Scrum. There are framework scaling Scrum, and so on. But it's not so obvious with the Kanban method, while actually it should be. It's very easy, very powerful as well. There are two ways, or maybe not two ways, two places where you can scale the Kanban method. One, definitely, it's to create a network of systems. So we have multi-team Kanban. Instead of having Kanban system created for one team, all the teams in my department, they use Kanban. If there are any dependencies among the teams, we can work it out, we can measure it, we can visualize it. This is really, really cool. But what is even better, in my opinion, a concept that I wouldn't introduce on day one, definitely, is the concept of vertical, not horizontal scaling. So the concept of flight levels, where you use the same Kanban method, the same Kanban system approach, but on different organizational levels. In the original approach by, I think, created by Klaus Leopold, we had the flight level one, so operative level, where teams produce what they do produce. Flight level two, the coordinative level, and strategic level or portfolio level, that is level three. At the end of the day, I thought it should be pretty obvious. You can use the same Kanban method for whatever team. For instance, you can go to the senior leadership team and create a Kanban for them. I believe you will not have tiny tasks on that board, but huge projects or initiatives they manage and they run. So a lead time wouldn't be a couple of days, but a couple of months. But still, the principles are the same. We limit work in progress and so on. If you connect these different levels, you have a full system, top down and from left to right, which works perfectly. Tony, what are your experiences with both ways of scaling Kanban?
So, as you know, I've been heavily involved with flight levels, and we did a very, very big introduction of this into an organization. One of the things that flight levels does also is it bridges the communication between different parts of the organization. So there's often a language used at the level of the team doing the work, which is very detailed and quite kind of specific. And although others in the organization might recognize it, it's so detailed they can't make sense of what does it actually tell them. And then on the flip side, there may be big strategic initiatives or thrusts that the organization want to make and do. And you can use the idea of flight levels to link those together, to bridge those two languages together with real-time information, or near real-time, because it's only as real-time as you move the card, obviously. But I think it's very good, flight levels, at bridging that communication gap between the two parts of the organization, and you're doing it based on the shared understanding of what's really happening. Whereas the network of systems is probably where I've seen the opposite of what you said about introducing this at all the teams at the same time. Sometimes you might introduce this one area and they have to do this alone and they find it quite hard. But what they do is they then involve others who are recipients of what they do or they create, or they're requesters, and they'll bridge out horizontally, either from where they're getting requests or who they're delivering stuff to. And that's how you see the network of systems starting to grow out in a sort of a, from idea through to delivery of the overall idea. We sometimes call that a value stream. Or it might just be a meshing, like a network of different parts of the organization that have to work together to get something done. So yeah, the horizontal is very powerful because that can spread across a whole organization, across different professions and all sorts. And then the flight levels allows you to link back to the big ideas about the organization, where it wants to go next and how it wants to achieve it. So I've seen it on both. We probably haven't got time to go into them in massive detail, but there are examples out there that, well, I mean, you use them in your training. I often use them with courses, with classes, and we dig into those as well as their own content.
Definitely. I think that what we will do is at some point of time after the webinar, somewhere on our social media, most likely we'll find a survey asking you what is the next Kanban kind of topic would like us to talk about a webinar, and flight levels perhaps would be on the list. I really wonder how those who watch us would vote. Literally a few weeks ago, I attended a conference, bigger conference in Eastern Europe, Agile by Example. I had a workshop literally about flight levels, but I also look at different talks during these 3 days, and there was no single talk directly touching the topic of flight levels, but a few already that talked in by the way about it. So I have a few conversations with different people, and although the concept is really old, really, maybe the name flight levels is pretty more or less new, but the concept itself is very, very old. I think it's getting getting more and more awareness, not only in social media. Not sure how about your conferences, whether many topics, many discussions about flight levels?
No, as you know, I did a session in the US this summer, and in the room, when I asked if people heard of this concept before, there were 2 hands shot up, and the 2 people in the room who knew about it were from Germany. So there's a lot more awareness in Germany than other parts of the world. In the US, it was very, very unheard of. There wasn't a massive amount of knowledge of it, and also the name doesn't land very well over there for some reason. Flight levels doesn't really work. But in Germany, which I know Klaus is from that part of the world, it's much more commonplace than most other parts. So yeah, a lot of it is about, as you say, awareness. And whether you call it flight levels or whatever you call it, it's about that kind of that linking and scaling this idea across an organization, especially through the organization's hierarchy. Because as we all know, organizations aren't flat. There are still hierarchies there, and you can't ignore them. They're not something that you want to ignore, because you can get the best high performing team in the world, but if not linked into what the organization wants to achieve, it's an untapped potential. So we want to link them, and this is one way of doing it.
And I think absolutely valid, because if I recall, few fake agile frameworks that must not be named, and when they touch the same different levels of organizational hierarchy and how to approach it, I think they missed the point. With the Kanban method as it is, out of the box, plus the concept of flight level is so natural, and I can't say easy, but not so difficult on the other side as well, to do that, especially if the organization has a proper Kanban on team level. So that's what's possible with Kanban, definitely. My only word of warning would be: do not start with flight levels. Start with proper team level Kanban and grow. Kanban as such, coming back to the principles, it's evolutionary change method. It's not a revolution. You're going to do it step by step, starting with what you have. And I bet you don't have flight levels on day one. That's a typical situation. All right, we're moving to the last part of our meeting, Tony. I thought we could also talk about different unusual situations where the Kanban method could be implemented. And by unusual situations, I mean actually 2 things. One are unusual, at least for agile people, industries. So not only IT, not only financial industry, but many, many other ones, but also unusual functions. So places where, or teams within a company where typically you wouldn't think of rolling out the agile ways of working. Let's start with the industry, Tony. What is the most unusual industry you've seen the Kanban method implemented?
Well, for me, and it shouldn't be that unusual, because it's an industry that's steeped in kind of lean manufacturing, but physical engineering was a really interesting and different place to do this, primarily because the audience were so ready for it, and it became quite natural to bring it in, but it had never been thought of in that area before. So I found that quite telling, because my experience of using this in the software world is you have to release things quite frequently to get the best out of this kind of way of working. That's not possible with physical engineering, because some things take multiple months because they're made of some kind of precious metal that just can't be molded or manufactured in the way you want it very quickly. So the physical engineering, we had to look at this very differently, but we still applied the method as we've described it today. And they did get benefits out of it, especially the visibility. The visibility was huge for them. They'd become so process driven that it become very difficult to understand what was holding them back. And this started to reveal that. And the work in progress limits, I know we said they were hard for that area. They created some slack space to do other stuff. So they actually created capacity, which was already there. They just couldn't access it. So that was the big unusual for me, I think, in terms of industry. What about you, Paweł?
Very, very similar. First of all, we know that the Kanban method, or Kanban, maybe not the method by Kanban, but the Kanban as such comes from lean management, lean manufacturing, Toyota production systems. So from physical engineering as such, not from IT or any knowledge work. So for me, it's so eye-opening whenever the Kanban method, by definition, a method for knowledge work, intellectual work, creative work. The entire method with principles, practices, flight path, and so on is implemented exactly as you say in the environments where the original Kanban originates from. So, for instance, construction, oil and gas, energy industries, and so on. Besides the fact that visibility of results, of outcomes, is very clear to everybody. It's a big leap for them, really huge step forward. What I think is interesting is also in many places they have literally physical working progress limits. Sometimes my working progress limits in IT is number of people I have in a team. But I'm not limited by the software or space of the hard drive and so on. If it is a construction and we are building something, we have literally physical limitation. I can't send or prepare too many work packages because there's no space to place them, and we need to deal with these constraints. Longer lead times, but I think also a higher satisfaction. That would be one kind of industries. Another one, I really enjoy tiny companies like a bakery, for instance, where technically the original Kanban from TPS would work, but the Kanban method can work as well. These are small but gentle, nice engagements as well. Fair enough. What about unusual functions within whatever industry, Tony?
So I've already mentioned HR. So I've found that any function or profession within an organization that receives requests, this is perfect. So finance, I worked with a team in finance who reduced their year end from quite a few days down to about 27, so 42 to 27 days. I've worked with actuaries before who've applied this approach, also procurement. And the one area I would pick out where the Kanban method is incredibly powerful is where you can't plan the work up front. So I'm thinking now of things like IT service desks or customer service areas of organizations who just take calls. You can't know what that call is going to be about up front. You can't even know when it's going to arrive. So where you can't plan the work up front, the Kanban method can just take that in its stride. It's designed to accept requests. That's what its purpose is. So I'd say they're probably two of the, or one example of a very powerful place to use this is where you can't plan things up front, like service desks or customer contact or customer centers. How about you, Paweł?
That's interesting because I think the very first thought of mine about implementation of the Kanban method in this kind of supportive functions was actually the Scrum training. It was nearly a decade ago. People at this training from that particular company were somehow forced to attend it. It was a Scrum training. And I received one question in a break because the guy was too shy to speak up publicly in the classroom. Can I give him a few suggestions? How can he implement Scrum in his team? It's a legal team, 3 lawyers supporting the board of members. And I thought instead of giving the answer, I will come back to the fundamentals of Scrum. Scrum is for solving complex problems. So I asked, what's so complex in your work? Is with uncertainty about how to do it or what to do it. And he realized that no, it's pretty obvious what to do, either to create a contract or check the contract. Even the number of requests is more or less similar every week. So my question back was, why Scrum in your case? I think you wouldn't. He said, well, they asked me to come for the training. I didn't know what to expect. And from word to word, we found out that perhaps Kanban method would help them visualize, limit work problems, increase even not effectiveness initially, but efficiency. And that would be really cool. So legal departments, HR departments, any support functions. On top of that, I can add that I don't believe in companies during or after their agile transformation, they have Scrum only or Kanban only. What I saw that works are either blended methods or different frameworks used whichever is needed in different places. Scrum here, Kanban here, something else over there. And what I typically see, especially in big companies, is not that 100% of company uses the agile ways of working. There are some teams, even if it's a huge campaign, we are agile. There are some teams, 10%, 50% of staff, hard to say, they are not using them because they are exactly the functions that support the rest. HR, finance, legal, and others ones. The Kanban method, it's absolutely appropriate for them as well. And if they culturally feel left alone without that big agile transformation, that could be something that we could propose to them. It won't harm them definitely. It can only increase their at least efficiency, at best effectiveness, and they will be part also of the entire transformation of the entire company. So that's also what's in my opinion possible with the method. Anything else, Tony?
Well, I've not really got much to add on that, other than when you mentioned about a blend of different teams working in slightly different ways, you made me think also flight levels sit neatly on top of all of that. So they're fairly agnostic, so they can sit on top of teams doing very different things and bring them all together. So it's just, as you were talking through there, I thought that's very true. You can't apply one approach, one method, one framework that rules all. You might have to use a combination of. So you do need to think about that when you're trying to scale that in an organization as well, is how do you bring this all back together? So not wanting to overplug it, but flight levels are great in that situation.
So blending methods, perhaps it's yet another great topic for another webinar. You've just reminded me a Kanban team in a company where that was a customer of both of us. It was a Scrum team. So it was a Scrum team, but the product owner for product backlog creation, management, and refinement used what we know as upstream Kanban. So literally we plugged upstream Kanban and downstream was executed within Scrum. And it worked perfectly for everybody, increasing transparency, understanding of what the product owner does, and so on and so on. But that's the other story. I think we are close to the end. If I could ask you, Tony, for a summary or a word of maybe a sentence of a message to those who are still listening to us, what would it be?
So I suppose my summary would be, if you're going to take something away from this around the question of what's possible with Kanban, think about what is it that you want to tame. So I often start there. So is there something that's just not behaving as you want it to today? And that's probably a clue of an area where you'd get the most benefit from trying to apply this kind of approach to working. Don't necessarily go for something that's easy and is going to work straight away. Look at something you want to tame, because I think, as we talked about earlier, those principles that are going to sort of help guide you through it, they're incredibly powerful for taming a situation that seems just out of control. That was a number of sentences, so I'm going to stop there, Paweł, and pass back to you.
No worries. Thank you very much. At the very beginning of our meeting, I mentioned we have a surprise, and here it goes. Exactly today at Meyeruk, you are starting a special promotion of our Kanban training in next 2 months actually. My very great guest, Tony Richards, is delivering a Kanban systems design class, and then advanced class, Kanban system improvements by Wojciech Walczak, also from Meyeruk. If you want to attend it, especially if there are more of you, if you have a group, we have interesting promotions prepared. The link to it under the video, but also you can also use the QR code over here. I think that from our side, that's it. I wonder if there are any questions from anybody listening to us. We're going to give you half a minute to place them in the chat window. If no, that would be it. That would be it. No questions yet. I think we did a great job because nobody is asking for any clarification, Tony. I really wonder what the next Kanban related topic would be. As I mentioned earlier, we're gonna run a tiny survey sooner than later on our social media. For now, that would be it. Tony, thank you very much for joining Agile Encounters. Everybody, thank you for watching us. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paweł. Bye, everyone.